Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Mem Zayin. We're going to get started with a braita at the beginning of our daf. Tanu Rabanan, kivsei atzeret ein mekachin et halechem ela b'shchita. So when we have these two sheep and they go along with the 2 loaves of bread, so the slaughtering of the 2 sheep sanctifies the bread. Ketzad. So how does this work? Shchatan, they're going to bring a bunch of examples and talk about when actually the sanctification works and when there comes to be some sort of issue or machloket, which we'll see. Shechatan lishman v'zarak daman lishman. If everything was done the way it's supposed to be, it was slaughtered. The 2 sheep were slaughtered lishman, for the name in the sake of that particular sacrifice for the shtei alechem. These are called shalmei atzeret. They're peace offerings for Shavuot. And zarak daman lishman, and they sprinkle the blood in the name of that proper korban. Kadash alechem. Then the bread, for sure, according to everybody, is sanctified. Shchatan, and what we mean by sanctified, we're going to see this later, means sanctified, what we call kedushat haguf. The bread itself is sanctified, okay? Not just its value, but it in of itself. There's ramifications of that, which we've talked about in the past, and we're going to see later today. If something is sanctified, kedushat haguf, it itself is sanctified, like usually animals for sacrifices, for example, then they cannot be redeemed. But if it's sanctified, kedushat damin, its value, then it can be redeemed. In this case, we're talking about, right, it's sanctified, the shchita and the zrika were done, now the bread is completely sanctified, kedushat haguf. Shchatan shelo lishman, v'zarak daman shelo lishman. What if everything was done for the sake of the wrong korban, both the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood? Lo kadash alechem. The lechem is just, bread is not sanctified at all, because the whole sacrifice was done not for the sake of the right sacrifice. Shchatan lishman, v'zarak daman shelo lishman. But what if it's half-half? What if it was slaughtered in the name of the right korban, but then the blood was sprinkled for the sake of the wrong korban? Halechem kadosh ve'eno kadosh divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says something very unclear. The bread is sanctified, but not sanctified. Okay, what does that mean? We don't know yet. We're going to have a machloket Rav and Abaye to understand what that means, but we're going to hold off on that machloket for a little bit. Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon omer la'olam eno kadosh ad sheyishchot lishman ve'yizrok taman lishman. According to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, this is not sanctified unless both the shchita and the zrika were done for the name of the proper korban. If they were done for the sake of the wrong korban, even just one of them, it's not sanctified. Okay, so now we're going to go, before we figure out what Rebbe really means, we're going to see what's at the root of the debate between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Where would they get this debate? Is it the shchita that determines the sanctity? Or does it, you also need to have the zrika determining the sanctity, not just the shchita? Okay, and then again, right, that means if it was slaughtered for the name of the right korban, but the blood was sprinkled in the sake of the wrong korban, then it's not going to be sanctified, according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. According to Rebbe, it is, because the shchita was done properly. So my Tana de Rebbe, what's his reason? Dichtiv, ve'et al yaseh zevach shlamim Hashem al salamatzot. So you should slaughter the ayil. Okay, this is actually talking about the nazir, but the nazir we already talked about is similar to the kivsei atzeret because there's an animal sacrifice and there's bread. And it says in the pasuk, you should do, okay, this word do is going to be important. It's ayil yaseh, you should do zevach shlamim. Zevach usually means slaughtering of the shlamim to God. It's a korban shlamim, that's the type of korban, peace offering. Al salamatzot, on the loaves of bread. Lemeimra de shchita mekadsha. So comes the Gemara and explains, this is Rebbe's shita. It says, when does it go with the bread? When it's zevach, slaughtering. The slaughtering is the verb mentioned here. Zevach, that means slaughtering. Rabbi Shimon, ya'aseh. He focuses on the word to do the zevach shlamim, meaning ad she'aseh kol asiyotav. We've seen this before. The words asiyah means all the actions, meaning the first, right, shchita, also kabbalah, also holacha, and ending with zrika, right? The 4 actions of slaughtering, catching the blood, walking it to the altar, and then putting it on the altar. So you need all of those to be lishma. If it's not all done lishma, the bread's not going to be sanctified. V'Rebbe, now we're going to do a ping pong. What does each one do with the other one's pasuk? V'Rebbe nami haktiv yaseh. It also says yaseh. What do you do with that? Well, iktiv zevach yaseh k'dikamarta. If it had said slaughtering and then it should be done, well then it would have meant excuse me, then it would have meant the slaughtering should be done, meaning and everything else should be done also in the right way. But because the term laso comes before the slaughtering, that comes to teach in what way does it make this having been done, this sacrifice, bizvicha, specifically with slaughtering. Rabbi Shimon haktiv zevach. Now, what's he going to do with the fact that it says zevach, which seems to indicate slaughtering? He needs the word slaughtering for something completely different. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hakol modin shetzarich sheyeh lechem b'shat shchita. Period. Hakol modin shetzarich sheyeh lechem b'shat shchita. He says zevach means that at the time of the slaughtering, the bread has to be in existence. Okay, it has to be there. Doesn't mean it's completely sanctified yet, but it does have to be there. You can't slaughter the two kifsei atzeret without the bread being, let's say, made, right, and ready to go. But it doesn't mean that they're completely sanctified in the slaughtering. Okay, so that's what each one does with the other one's pasuk. Now we still have to figure out, which we didn't figure out yet, is what does Rebbe mean when he says kadosh ve'eno kadosh? So my kadosh ve'eno kadosh, Abai Yamal, kadosh ve'eno gamur. It's sanctified, but not completely sanctified. Rava Amal, kadosh ve'eno nital. It's sanctified, but it's not permitted to be eaten because the zrika wasn't done properly. So now the Gemara says, my benai, what's the difference between them? Because if you say sanctified, but not completely sanctified, we're assuming that also means that it can't be eaten, because unless it's completely sanctified, the bread's not going to be permitted to eat. So remember, it only becomes permitted to eat once you slaughter the animal. If the animal is slaughtered improperly, right, or once you, sacrifice the animal. If the sacrifice isn't done properly, then the bread's not going to be permitted. So if one says it's only partially sanctified, and the other one says it's sanctified but not permitted to eat, what's really the difference between them? Okay, this is what I mentioned before about whether or not the pidyon will be effective, whether if you redeem that bread now onto money, does the sanctity leave the bread or not? Now, what does this really mean? In other words, is it kedushat haguf or is it kedushat damim? Because that's going to determine whether redeeming it will work. Remember, redeeming only works if its value is sanctified. But if it itself becomes sanctified just by the slaughter alone, then that's going to mean that it's kadosh kedushat damim, kedushat haguf. It itself is sanctified, and then it cannot be redeemed. Okay, who says what? Good question. There's a problem with the girsa. I don't know what it says by you, but by me, I'm going to actually change the girsa of what it says, because I'm going to go with the commentaries that switch it, and it should read like this. La Abaye tafis pidyono, le Rava lo tafis pidyono. Abaye says, because he says kadosh ve'eno gamor, it's not completely sanctified, means it's partially sanctified, means it's only kedushat damim, only its value is sanctified. But le Rava lo tafis pidyono, it will not be able to be redeemed because it itself becomes sanctified kedushat haguf. The only limitation is it can't be eaten because the blood wasn't sprinkled properly, but it is inherent sanctity. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to say, well, only one of these really seems to work because Bishlama le Rava. Now, I just want to remind you, both Rava and Abai are coming to explain Rebbe's position. They don't have anything to say about Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. But if we say either one thinks it's kedushat damim, one thinks it's kedushat haguf, or one thinks only its value, one thinks even it in of itself becomes completely sanctified, well, that's going to affect how we understand the machloket between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and you'll see. So Bishlam al Rav, according to Rava, and like I said, there's different girsaot here. Some people think it's the reverse and explain the Gemara differently. I'm going with this interpretation now. Bishlama le Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, le Rava. Rava makes sense, because again, Rava said it's kadosh kedushat haguf, according to our interpretation, and then hainu deika ben Rebbe le Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Then we're going to say very simply like this: they assume right now that Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, and this is going to remain an assumption, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon must think it's somewhat sanctified the bread because it was slaughtered. It's just the problem is you didn't sprinkle the blood properly, but it was slaughtered properly, and it's slaughtering the bread does become somewhat sanctified. So we're going to assume that Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon thinks the bread becomes sanctified only though kedushat damim, okay? And then according to Rava, it's going to work perfectly because then Rebbe comes and says, no, it's kadosh kedushat haguf. And that's really the machloka between them. So Rebbe is going to say kadosh ve'eno kadosh, meaning it has inherent sanctity, even though it can't be eaten. And Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon is going to say it doesn't have any inherent sanctity. It only has sanctity of its value is sanctified. Now, of course, even according to him, it can't be eaten because, right? But it would have ramifications in terms of pidyon, by the way. Could it be redeemed at this point, or could it not be redeemed? So that could be the machloket between them. But if Abaye thinks that kadosh ve'eno kadosh means it's only kadosh, kedushat damim, only its value is sanctified, then theoretically he and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon are saying the same thing. It's only got value of its value is sanctified, but it doesn't have inherent sanctity. And then there's really no machloket. So they say no. Ika benayu le'ifsule b'yotze. Yotze is a psul. If something leaves the temple, what happens? Okay, that's a disqualification. In what case? If the item is inherent sanctity, like an animal. An animal is designated as sacrifice and slaughtered, and then it leaves, it's ruined. Okay, because it has inherent sanctity and it was slaughtered also. So here, if you slaughter the animals and the bread leaves the temple, well, it doesn't have inherent sanctity according to either opinion. But since Abaye says it's kadosh ve'eno kadosh, well, it has enough sanctity. Now, both say really it's kedushat damim, but we're going to say that Abaye's language, or again, Abaye understanding Rebbe, the way he understands Rebbe is kadosh ve'eno gamor. It's not completely sanctified, so it doesn't have inherent kedusha, but it has a little bit of inherent kedusha, enough to make it ruined if you take it out of the sanctuary. And the other opinion is going to say, right, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon is going to say no. It's not psul yotze because it's only its value is sanctified. And things that have their value sanctified, they can leave the azara. It's not a problem. So that's going to be the difference between them. Okay, now we're going to move to a question. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak mi Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak asked Rabbi Chia bar Abba the following question. Exactly our case. Okay, we have animals, the sheep from the Kivsei Atzeret, right, from the Shavuot offering, that was slaughtered for the sake of the right korban, but then the blood was sprinkled shelo lishman. Here comes his question. Oto halechem, so the bread that goes along with it, which we already said, right, either according to Rebbe is kadosh ve'eno kadosh, which we had two interpretations, or according to Rabbi Shimon, isn't really kadosh, right, because it got ruined, okay, which again, we said maybe has inherent sanctity, but for sure, right, it's not, right, what was the language he used? Lo lami no kadosh, right, it's not really kadosh, okay, it's not inherent kadosh yet, or at all it won't be. So, oto halechem mahu ba'achila, can you eat that bread? Now the Gemara is going to say, what kind of question are you asking? Aliba Daman, according to nobody should you be allowed to eat the bread, and it's pretty obvious why would he be asking this question. So let's go through who we have. We have Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and then we have Rebbe according to Rava and according to Abaye. So let's go through each option. Aliba to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, which means it's not sanctified, right? Ha'amar zriku de makacha. Only in zrika is it sanctified, which means it never became sanctified, which means of course you can't eat it. You can only eat this bread when you bring the animal and slaughter it properly and do the sprinkling of the blood, and then that permits it to be eaten. Without that, of course, you can't eat this bread. If you go by Rebbe, well, Bein la'Abaye, Bein la'Rava, we said that both of them agreed that kadosh ve'eno nitalhu. Both of them agreed in the end that while it might be sanctified, it's definitely not going to be permitted, right? Whether it's kedusha damim or kedusha guf, it doesn't really matter. Either which way, this bread is not allowed to be eaten. So, who is this question asked according to? So what we're going to do now, it's going to take a little while, okay, and it's a little bit of a confusing sugya, but what we're going to do is we're going to bring a third opinion, a third Tanaic opinion. We're going to bring actually two opinions. We're going to say it actually goes according to Rabbi Akiva, as appears in some other Braita machloket he has between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, and we're going to say that the question is asked according to Rabbi Akiva. Just to give you the complete structure that we're going to do, then we're going to have, in order to explain that, we're going to go with Rav Sheshet's interpretation of the machloket, okay? And then we're going to have the question. Now, we're not going to answer it, but we're going to have a question according to Rav Sheshet's understanding of Rabbi Akiva. This would be a valid question to ask. There would be a reason to ask the question. We're not going to end up with an answer. But the Gemara then is going to bring Rav Papa, who's going to say that's not the way to understand the machloket of Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Eliezer, and there's in fact no question, not according to Rabbi Akiva either. And then the Gemara is going to try to reject Rav Papa, but then they're going to reinstate it. So we're going to be left with two possibilities. Either according to Rav Sheshet, they asked the question according to Rabbi Akiva, even though they, in the end, didn't have an answer, According to our Papa, the question couldn't even be asked according to Rabbi Akiva, in which case we're left back where we were a minute ago, which is, who is this question asked according to, and we don't really have an answer even to who is the question asked. Forget about that, we don't have an answer to the question. Okay, so let's read. I mean, obviously, if we say the question was asked according to nobody, right, it doesn't make sense the question was asked, we're really left with, of course, the bread wouldn't be permitted according to anybody. But still, it seems like he had a question, and we don't really understand where he had a question. Okay, so let's go through. Ela liba de Tana. It must be according to this Tana. The Tani Avua de Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. Okay, the father of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba brought this braita. Shtei alechem shiatzu bein shchita l'zrika. So 2 loaves of bread that were left the azara before the blood was sprinkled. Now, they're already sanctified at the time of shchita, and they leave the azara, they become disqualified. And then the question is, when you do the zrika, does the zrika have effect? Okay, now we're going to talk about for what purposes. What if the zrika was done chutz lizmanam, and which makes it pigul? It was done outside the time, meaning when they sprinkled the blood, they thought, oh, we're going to burn the parts on the altar or eat the meat beyond the designated time. That makes the animal, the meat of the animal, pigul. Does it affect the bread that left the azara? So we're going to see it again. Let's read it. So after the slaughtering, before the sprinkling of the blood, zarak daman shel kvasim chutz zmanan, and they sprinkled the blood with a thought that this was going to be eaten or burnt, burned, parts of the animal that were supposed to be burnt outside their given time. Rabbi Eliezer omer ein balechem mishum pigul. Rabbi Akiva omer yesh balechem mishum pigul. So Rabbi Eliezer says the bread is pigul also, not just the meat, but because the bread, in the time of the slaughter, they got connected, the bread became sanctified. Even though the bread now left, it's actually going to be pigul also. Just like the meat is pigul. Again, what does that mean? It means if you eat the pigul, you're going to get karet. So if you eat the meat or you eat the bread, you will get karet. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ein balechem mishum pigul. There is no pigul in the bread. And Rabbi Akiva omer yesh balechem mishum pigul. Okay, sorry that I explained it the wrong way. But anyway, we have a debate. Is there pigul in the bread? Is there not? Rabbi Eliezer says, no pigul. Rabbi Akiva says, there is pigul in the bread. Okay, obviously they all think there's pigul in the meat. Now, what is this machloket based on? So here comes Rosh Hashem's explanation. And from there we're going to see that you could ask the question that they asked before about the bread that was yotze, okay, that left. Okay, we can ask that question, if the zrika was done shalom lishma, are you allowed to eat the bread? Okay, we'll see where we're going soon. But Amar Rav Sheshet, Hani Tanai ki Rebbe Spiralu. They're now going to say, both those Tanaim think that they hold like Rebbe, meaning they both hold like Rebbe, saying, to Amar Shchita Makadsha. They both think that the Shchita sanctifies the bread. So the bread was sanctified, then left the Azara. It was outside, we're assuming now, it was outside the Azara at the time the blood was sprinkled, and the blood was sprinkled with a pigul thought. So now, Mihu, Rabbi Eliezer Saval, Rabbi Eliezer L'Ta'ameh, Da'amal ein zrika mo'elet liyotze. And Rabbi Akiva L'Ta'ameh, Da'amar zrika mo'elet liyotze. Now this has to do with machloket they have in Me'ilah, which you can see on the next page. Okay, maybe I'll just read it inside and then we'll explain. But I'll say it in simple words, and then we'll explain what it really means. Rabbi Eliezer holds that zrika mo'elet means, is it effective? So he holds ein zrika mo'elet liyotze. Zrika, if you have zrika of a korban and there's part of it outside, the zrika has no effect on what left, and basically was disqualified because it left. And Rabbi Akiva thinks if you do zrika, it actually is effective on what went outside. Okay, what does this mean? So we're going to see it right now. It's a Gemara, it's a Mishnah in Me'ilah. Ditnan, okay, top of Amud Bet. Imurei kochim kalim shiatzu lifnei zrikat ami. If you have parts that are supposed to be burnt of kochim kalim, now, let's just remember the rules of Kodshim Kalim. Kodshim Kalim, at first, actually, there's no law of Me'ilah. There's no misuse of consecrated property until what point? Because in the end, you're going to be able to eat the meat. But at the moment that you sprinkle the blood, what happens is, Me'ilah kicks in, the prohibition of using consecrated items, kicks in specifically to the imurim. Because as soon as you sprinkle the blood, that permits the fatty parts and the kidneys and that stuff to be burned on the altar. So at that moment, the imurim, which is that category for all the parts that get burnt on the altar, basically, if they left, now here, what normally happens is they're going to have laws of me'ila as soon as the blood is sprinkled. However, here comes a machloket about what if those parts were taken out of the azara and they're disqualified. So now they can't be burned on the altar. But does the zrika, since zrika normally makes the laws of me'ila kick in right away for the imurim of these kochim kalim of the lighter, the lower level sanctity, because again, lower level sanctity doesn't have a prohibition of misuse of consecrated items until the zrika. So if these items were already disqualified, though, from going on the altar, does the zrika affect them or not? Right? The simple understanding would be to say, no, of course it doesn't affect them, and then me'ila never kicks in for those things. And that's exactly what Rabbi Eliezer says. Rabbi Eliezer omer, ein mo'alim behem. Not only ein mo'alim behem, there's no me'ila on these imurim, and if for whatever reason you were to do the zrika with a machshava pigul, okay, so ein chayavin alehem mishum pigul notar v'tame. There's no din of pigul. If you leave them over beyond the designated time, you're not going to get karet for eating them because they're already disqualified. And there's no tame issue because they're not kachim anymore. So Rabbi Eliezer thinks it has no effect. Zrika on something that left has no effect on it. So yes, it's true, they were sanctified at the beginning, okay, with the shechita, but then they left the temple. So the zrika, which in this case was shalol lishma, has no bearing at all on the lechem, which means the lechem went out. It was disqualified. Once it's disqualified, it can't be eaten, period. But Rabbi Akiva omer mo'alim behem. Okay, so now we have two different cases, right? One is if you had a pigul thought. The other is what if you did the zrika lo lishma, okay? But now, Rabbi Akiva says mo'alim behem in the case of a pigul thought of the zrika, when the parts had left the azara, there's me'ila, v'chayavim alehem mishum pigul notar v'tame. So if they were imrei kochim, there's now laws of me'ila, even though they left. Still, the zrika is effective to make the laws of me'ila kick in now, the imurim, even though they can't actually be burned. And if you had a pigul machshava, that would ruin these imurim that are even outside. So if somebody eats them now, they'll be chayav karet. If they're left over beyond the designated time and they become notar, they're chayav karet. If they become impure, right, someone eats them when they're impure, karet. Okay, so that's pigul notar and tame. Now, we're going to say the following. So here comes the question. The question is going to be according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says that the zrika, that's pigul, let's say, has effect even on something that's yotze, to ruin it and to make it pigul. Now we call that lechumbra. It's a stringency, right? Because we're going to take this. Theoretically, you might have said maybe there's no laws of me'ila, or maybe there's no pigul on this meat because it was taken outside and it was ruined already. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, there is anyway. So that's a chumrah. So now we're going to say like this. Midizrika pigul, kavala lechem bepigul, beyotze, kibasal. Now, if you were to be zorek the pigul, it would affect, now, okay, if we take this exact thing that we said by the pigul. So you have in our case, let's say you slaughtered it, regular, you sprinkled the blood, and then the bread went out, and then you sprinkled the blood with a pigul machshava. So just like the meat of these animals would become pigul, also the bread would become pigul, because it's all connected, even though it's yotze. That's Rabbi Akiva's whole shita. But zrika and zrika shelo lishma nami shar yaleh lalechem. Well, then maybe we could say if the zrika was done shelo lishma, maybe it would still permit the bread. Now this is going lekula. This is saying maybe we could say if the zrika still has effects on something that was yotze, right? Then perhaps you could say that a zrika that was done shelo lishma, l'shem the wrong korban, maybe still could permit the bread to be able to be eaten. Okay, and that's our question. So again, going back to our question, kivsei atzer shechatan lishman, v'zarak daman shelo lishman. So again, the zrika was done with the wrong machshava. It was for the sake of the wrong korban. But perhaps just like zrika done on bread that had left and was disqualified, maybe here a zrika with a disqualified thought, right? And there it would ruin it and make it pigul. So maybe here a disqualified thought would still actually permit this bread to be eaten, okay? Because the zrika was done, even though it was done for the sake of the wrong korban. So that's the question. O dilma lechumra amrina lekula la amrina, or maybe this whole halacha that the zrika that was done incorrectly could still affect the bread, maybe is only a question of chumrah, stringency, but not lenient. Maybe not to go in a lenient direction and permit the bread to be eaten. That's the way Rav Sheshet understands the question. In other words, Rav Sheshet understands the machloket, Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Eliezer, that they both agree with Rebbe that the shechita sanctifies it. Now, once it's sanctified, and then even though, right, so here again, I just want to make the comparison clear. In the case that we had of the pigul, we had a case where the bread left was disqualified, and yet the pigul machshava affects it as well. Here we have a case where the bread is sanctified completely because of shechita, because we're going with Rebbe. It was completely sanctified, or kadosh ve'ino kadosh, really, right? We had this machloket, but whether you hold the bai rava, but it was sanctified in the shechita, and then your zrika was done for the sake of the wrong korban. Could that, though, at least permit the bread to be eaten? Okay, and this is not right. So Rabbi Kiva goes like Rebbe, but he takes it one step farther to say that a zrika that was done, even when there's something with the bread, right, that's off, or when the zrika's off, it could still affect the bread, and maybe it would actually permit the bread to be eaten. Okay, now, Matkafla Rav Papa. Rav Papa says that's definitely not the way to understand the machloket, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Kiva, and in fact, you can't ask this question according to Rabbi Akiva. Why? I think you misunderstood the case, he says. How do you know their machloket is when you took the bread out the way we described it, and the bread was out at the time the blood was sprinkled? And then again, it was sanctified, and then went out, was disqualified, because we said they both hold like Rebbe, saying no. Dilma, perhaps their machloket is, so he's not saying definitely, but he's suggesting that maybe there's a different way to read the machloket. B'di'itnuhu abarai. It's when they were outside. That if they were outside, maybe they both agree that if it's outside and stays outside during the time of this zrika that was done with a pigul thought, okay, we're back to understanding the braita that we quoted with the original, right, the machloket, Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Eliezer. For sure, the zrika is not going to have any effect because it's outside and it was completely disqualified. And then the zrika of the pigul machshav is not going to create a situation of pigul even l'chumra. Ubahadar eilenu plige. But what's our machloket about? If it went out and came back in, and the bread happened to be physically present inside when the blood was sprinkled. Now, why does it make a difference? Well, it only makes a difference depending on who you hold by. We're now going back to the machloket Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. To Rabbi Eliezer, savar la kirebi, damar shchita makadsha, vi pasla lehu b'yotze. Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rebbe. What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? Remember, ein zrika mo'elet. Zrika has no effect on what's outside. Because why? Because he holds like Rebbe. At the time of shchita, this bread was sanctified. Then it got taken out. You took something that was sanctified. It's now completely disqualified. Because it's disqualified, the zrika has no effect on it whatsoever. For anything. Not for l'chumra, not l'kula. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Da'amal shchita lo makadsha. So now we're going to explain like this. Rabbi Akiva, according to this understanding, Rav Papa, is holding like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, which means what? He thinks that this is not sanctified at shchita at all. Why is that important? Well, b'damar shchita lo makadsha. Then it's going to be very significant. The whole idea that it was brought outside and then brought back in and was in at the time of zrika. Because why? Because lomit paslu b'yotze. There's no disqualification of yotze if it wasn't even kadosh kedushat haguf, right? Taking something outside that just has value as sanctified is not a disqualification. So when it was back inside, let's go back to Rabbi Kiva in the Braita now. Let's read it. Rabbi Kiva says, yesh balecha mishum pigul. Why does the bread have an issue of pigul right now? The bread has pigul because it became sanctified now. It became sanctified and it was never yotze. Now it's completely part of the sacrifice because it was inside at the time of the moment when it becomes sanctified. And at that moment, what happened? Well, it became sanctified and then immediately became pigul. And because it became pigul, well, the bread became pigul, and the animal, the meat became pigul, and that affects the bread as well, which became sanctified together with the animal at that same moment. So that's why the bread's going to have pigul according to Rabbi Akiva. But again, just to review, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no pigul because the bread on the bread, there is obviously on the meat, but the bread was completely disqualified. So the zrika has no effect on it whatsoever. Now, if we go with Rabbi Akiva and we say the bread actually was inside at the time of Zrika, and he holds like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Let's go back to our case. The question that they asked originally, which is, if you slaughter them lishman and then sprinkle the blood shelo lishman, can you eat that bread? Of course you can't, because it became sanctified only at the time of the, right, according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, what did we say? It doesn't even become sanctified, because the zrika was done shelo lishma. If you don't have zrika done lishma, well, it can't become sanctified. So, of course, it's not sanctified. If it's not sanctified, it can't be eaten. So there's no question according to Rabbi Akiva, according to this. And that's Rav Papa's claim, that then I don't really know who your question was asked according to, because it doesn't make sense to ask the question either according to Rabbi Akiva. So we said it can't be Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, it can't be Rabbi, and it can't be Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva basically holds like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so Gemara is going to now question Rav Papa for a minute, but then we're going to reinstate Rav Papa. Question is like this. Hi, Mai, can you possibly explain it in that way? Iyamar bishlama Rabbi Akiva ki Rebbe svirale. If you say that Rabbi Akiva held like Rebbe, Da'amar shchita makachalehu. If you hold like Rav Sheshet, who said that Rabbi Akiva holds like Rebbe, that the shchita sanctified it, and then it became pigul later at the zrika, and then we say basically, right, again, this is the braita, even when it went outside, the zrika is going to have effect on it. Hainu de ka'amar, well then you can explain Rabbi Akiva very well. Hainu de ka'amar Rabbi Akiva de kachlu b'shchita v'at zrika v'kavalehu b'pigul. This is going to make more sense when we see the other opinion, the other option, where they're going to reject it. But basically, the way they say like this: at the time of sanctification, at the time of slaughtering, it became sanctified, and at the time of zrika, it had a pigul thought, and even though it's outside, Rabbi Akiva thinks that's affected by what went on inside, and the zrika comes and ruins it and makes it pigul. But if you think like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who said it's not even sanctified at shchita, then you're going to have a problem. Maybe you thought this when I was saying it, maybe you didn't, but listen. Da'amar zvicha lo makadsha, so slaughtering doesn't do anything. Well then, zrika pigul mi makadsha? How can you say that at the moment it gets sanctified, was it zrika, and then there was a pigul thought and that ruins it, like a second after it gets sanctified? But that makes no sense. Because you're basically saying that what's sanctified, it was a zrika that was done with the wrong intent. How can a zrika with the wrong intent sanctify the bread? You need a proper action to sanctify it, not a wrong action. And how do we know this? Because of something that Rav Gidol says in the name of Rav. V'ha'amar Rav Gidol amar Rav, zrika pigul eina mevi'a lidei me'ilah ve'eina motzi'a midei me'ilah. Zrika of pigul is, I'm just going to say it very simply, is ineffective. Okay? It's ineffective that it can't bring upon me'ilah, which we're going to see, like in the example we talked about earlier, the imurim of kochim kalim, and it doesn't remove me'ilah from kochim kochim. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a second, what this means, because the Gemara is going to explain. Eina mevi'a lidei me'ilah b'imurei kochim kalim. That means that, again, that's the imurim. Normally the sprinkling of the blood permits, okay, the meat to be eaten, okay, but actually the meat theoretically was really permitted from the beginning. There was no me'ilah. What it does is it causes the isur of me'ilah, the misuse of consecrated property, to basically go upon the imurim of the kochim kalim. But if it's a zrika with a pigul thought, it doesn't do that because it's a completely disqualified zrika. And it's not motziami de me'ilah b'basar kochim kochim. If you have, let's say, a korban chatat, which is kochim kochim, from the beginning it has me'ilah. The zrika, what it does is it removes the prohibition of me'ilah, the prohibition against using consecrated property. It removes it from the meat because now the meat's going to be permitted to the kohanim. But if the zrika was done improperly, it doesn't remove it. So now we're going to say, so there's no way that you could say that according to Rabbi Akiva, and this is the way Rav Papa tried to say, according to Rabbi Akiva, at the moment of zrika, if he really holds like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and shchita doesn't make it sanctified, then the moment of this zrika that was done for the wrong korban, it's actually going to make the bread sanctified to the extent that maybe even we're going to allow it to be eaten, and that's the question? No, that doesn't make any sense. There's no way that could sanctify the bread when it was a completely disqualified zrika. And, right, Rav Gidol says in the name of Rav that zrika for sure, if it's disqualified, doesn't bring pigul upon it, right? It doesn't remove me'ilah, it doesn't bring in me'ilah, which means it's certainly not going to sanctify this bread. So, in a nutshell, we're basically saying that the sanctification can't happen at the time when the sanctifying of the bread can't happen when the zrika was done improperly. So you can't explain Rabbi Akiva to say this bread is sanctified, right? And basically, then we're going to ask the question, or the bread becomes pigul, like in the case that Rabbi Akiva said, the bread is pigul in the actual braita, that the pigul goes upon the bread, if you think that the bread only became sanctified at the moment of the zrika, because a zrika with a pigul machshava can't make that bread both sanctified and ruined at the same time. But then the Gemara says, Lavi totiv de Rav Gidol Amarav, you tried to reject Rav Papa's understanding because you said this can't all happen at the same time because of what Rav Gidol Amarav said. But Rav Gidol Amarav, as we're going to see when we get to Me'ilah, is rejected. And actually, theoretically, it could all happen at the same time, which means that Rav Papa could be right, that this is all really only according, Rabbi Akiva is all according to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. It wasn't sanctified all at Shechita. It only came in now. It became sanctified at that moment. It basically became pigul. And then, basically, this wouldn't, if it was the case of the bread, what would happen? The sanctification would kick in, but at the same time, the bread is disqualified, and there's no way that, right, you'd be allowed to eat the bread because the sacrifice was never brought lishma, and therefore, there's no question, could you eat the bread? So we're left with two possibilities. Either you read it like Rav Sheshet, in which case there is a question. Now we go back to what I said at the beginning. We don't actually have an answer to this question. Or we don't, and the question is asked according to Rabbi Akiva, the way Rav Sheshet understood him, that actually was sanctified in the time of Shechita, and then the question is, well, maybe the bread could still be permitted. Just like it works to have pigul come upon it, l'chumra, maybe we would say at l'kula also, that it would actually allow the bread to, right, in the case of Yotze, we could call it pigul. In this case, when it was never actually done properly, but maybe it would still allow us to eat the bread l'kula. Or maybe not, maybe we just say it l'chumra, not l'kula. But if we take it like Rav Papa, then the question isn't asked at all because Rabbi Akiva doesn't even hold like Rebbe, and it's a totally different understanding of Rabbi Akiva's Shita. Okay, that's the end of that question. Now we move to another question, Rabbi Yirmiyah question, a classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question, and with this we'll finish for today. Ba'amine Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Rabbi Zera. Kivsei atzeret sheshachatan lishman va'avad halechem. If you have these sheep that you slaughter them lishma and then you lost the bread. So, maybe you can continue to slaughter, sacrifice the animal by sprinkling the blood. Okay, as you slaughtered the animal, the bread became sanctified, but then you lost the bread. And now you want to sprinkle the blood for the sake of a regular shlamim. In order to what? Lahatir basar b'achila, in order to allow the meat to get eaten. Okay, the bread, forget about it. But maybe you can, on purpose now, do it shalol lishma, because you've already ruined the korban. Once the bread is sanctified, remember we learned, ma'at vin ze'etzeh, you can't do one without the other. So once the animal's slaughtered and the bread is, right, and the bread becomes sanctified, you can't bring the animals anymore, but maybe you could switch it to lo lishma and bring it as a regular shlamim and then eat the meat. Because remember, right, a korban that's brought shalol lishma, as long as it's not a chatat or a pesach pesach bismano, you can actually bring as a different animal. Right? If you did it shalol lishma, now here we're saying, can you actually do it shalol lishma in order to kind of save the meat? So comes Rabbi Zera and says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, what a crazy question. Amarle, and we saw this in Zvachim also, a reaction like this to the question. Yesh lecha davar she'eino kasher lishmo v'kasher shalol lishmo. How could you take this animal that can't be brought for its right sake and then do it for the wrong sake and have it be accepted? Okay, if remember, like we said, if you accidentally did it for the wrong sake, or you did it maybe even on purpose, but it was done for the wrong sake, we'll accept it, right? But it doesn't fulfill the obligation. But here you're taking a sacrifice that can't be done in its right way, and you're now saying, oh, let's do it in the wrong way, and that will make it better. That's ridiculous. To which Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what do you mean it's ridiculous? Below, of course you could do that. A Pesach before midday, is not kasher as a Pesach, but you could bring it as a shlamim. That's a Pesach shelo bismano, right? Let's say it's 2 days before. You could sacrifice it as a shlamim. If you want, it would be accepted, even though it's not accepted for its own sake. So that's the same thing. So they say, no. Comes Rabbi Zera and he says, "What? No. Hachi kamina. This is what let me clarify why I think what you're saying is absurd. Yesh lecha davar shenir'eh lishmo v'nidchami lishmo. I'm talking about something that was valuable to be used in and of itself, and then was rejected. The Pesach before its time was never valid to be a Pesach yet. It hadn't gotten to that point. Here you had something that was valid that was rejected because you lost the bread. So you ruined it, right? Nidcha dichoy is always an issue with korbanot. Once it's rejected, how could you possibly do it? And then, eino kasher lishmo, you can't bring it as itself, but you could do it kasher shelo lishmo, for the sake of another korban. That's absurd. Comes Rabbi Yirmiyah, says, what do you mean? I'll give you an example. V'harei pesach v'lo v'na. What do you mean? Harei pesach achar zmano. If you didn't use your korban, you put aside the animal for Pesach. You didn't use it on the 14th. It became rejected now because you can't use it anymore past Pesach. And then, right, B'shar Yamot HaShana, you could actually use it. Don't read the words Kodem Chatzot. That makes no sense. They take it out. But B'shar Yamot HaShana, on all days of the year, you can use it as a shlamim. So even though it was rejected after Pesach passed. So it comes Rabbi Zera and he says, no. Hachi kamina. I'm going to clarify my question even more against your question. Rabbi Zera says, but this was actually already slaughtered for the sake. If you have a Pesach that was slaughtered and then you left it over till the next day, of course you can't bring it. So here this was slaughtered lishmo, and then nidchamisha lishmo, and then it couldn't be used anymore because you lost the bread. Eino kasher lishmo, and yet kasher shelo lishmo, we're going to use it for the sake of another korban? To which Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what do you mean? I'll give you an example, and we're going to end with that. V'harei toda, what about a korban toda? If you slaughter a korban toda and then the breads get ruined, what happens? What do you do if you didn't sprinkle the blood yet? You sprinkle the blood l'shem shlamim. You can bring it as a shlamim. So therefore he says, why don't we do the same thing here with our shalmei atzeret? So they can't be brought a shalmei atzeret, but let's move it into a regular shlamim and bring it like that, and then we can eat the meat. So comes Rabbi Zera and says, no, you cannot do that. Sorry. Shani toda de Rahmana karya shlamim. A toda is specifically called zevach shlamim, meaning it's already called like it is a shlamim. So it's a type of shlamim. Now it's true this one is too, but it's not really called specifically extra word shlamim anywhere. And it's a different type of shlamim. That's another reason. But anyway, they say there's a special drasha by toda because you didn't really need those words there to say it really can easily morph into a shlamim, even if it was slaughtered lishma and then got ruined for some reason, like the bread got ruined. So Rabbi Yirmiyah's question is answered as no, you cannot do that, even though it sounds like an interesting creative idea, but the answer is no. Okay, so let's review our daf. What did we do today? We started with, and really it was mainly one topic, of this animal that was slaughtered, the two animals, the kivsei atzeret that was slaughtered, lishman, but then, right, we had a few different options, but our real case that we discussed today, for the most part, was slaughtered lishma. Then it was zarak daman shelo lishman. Is the bread sanctified or not? We saw the machlok Rabbi Eliezer. Then we went from there to, right, what were the reasons behind them? We had the two explanations of Rabbi, whether it's kadosh, really kedushat haguf, or not kedushat haguf, Rav and Abaye. Is it just kedushat damim? But it is sanctified from the shechita. Then we had to figure out, according to one of them, what's the difference between that and Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Shimon, which we answered, right, which is it disqualified b'yotzei? Like it's, even though we'll say it's kedushat damim, Rabbi still thinks it's a little more than that. Enough to be disqualified. It's enough kedushat haguf to be disqualified if you take it out. And then we have this big question of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, who asked Rabbi Chia bar Abba, what about if the same exact case, could you eat the bread? Now it was clear from both Rabbi and Rav Elazar bar Rav Shimon you couldn't eat the bread, so we had to figure out maybe this question is according to Rabbi Akiva. And Rav Sheshet, the way he understood the machlok of Rav Elazar and Rabbi Akiva about pigul, could the bread become pigul? Well, right, if it's yotzei, if it left. So the way Rav Sheshet understood it, which is it's still outside, and it was already sanctified at shechita, right, according to both interpretations, and then it became this debate, could it or not? And then maybe according to Rabbi Akiva, who says it would become pigul, maybe he would say it would also be permitted to be eaten. But Rav Papa had a completely different way of understanding it, that it actually, according to Rabbi Akiva, it wasn't sanctified yet. It only became sanctified at the time of the zrika, and it had gone out and come back in, so it was inside at the time, and then it became sanctified, and at the same time it became pigul. And that's why he thought it was pigul. Okay? Whereas Rabbi Eliezer thought it didn't become pigul because he said it was sanctified at the time of shechita, like Rabbi, and when it went outside it was disqualified, so even though it came back in, it was too late. But according to Rabbi Akiva, it was never really disqualified because it wasn't really sanctified until then. And then, of course, in that case, he's not going to allow the bread to be eaten because that's Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon's position, who it was never really sanctified properly. So no one would think you can eat the bread there, and that was the way Rav Papa understood. We tried to reject Rav Papa, but in the end we knocked out the rejection against him, and it still stands. So we weren't really sure whether we even have a question or not, or who the question was asked according to. And even if we do have it asked according to Rabbi Akiva, we don't have an answer, which was according to Rav Shesha, but we don't have an answer to the question. And then came Rabbi Yirmiyah with this question of, well, what if the bread got lost in the middle there after it was already sanctified, and after now you can no longer sacrifice this as a kivsei atzeret, because they're ma'akvin atzeret, right? Without one, you can't do the other. Without the bread, you can't do the animals. But maybe you can morph it into and bring it shelo lishma, the sake of a regular shlamim, and then be able to eat the meat. To which Rabbi Zera said, that's an absurd havamina, and every time Rabbi Yirmiyah tried to bring him an example, oh, but this, oh, but that, oh, but that, but every time Rabbi Zera had a response, so he said, no, you can't say what you're saying. It's a ridiculous suggestion. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day and a Shabbat Shalom.